I'm Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, and you join me today in the library. And today, as we come together, I should like to reflect with you about the path through Congress of the legislation to resurrect the rank of Lieutenant General, which was awarded to me, and some of the background of what was happening both for and against that legislation. In 1863, things were not going well in the war, and for President Lincoln, in fact, there was already talk about replacing him for the 1864 election. The midterm elections had gone very badly for the Republicans. A lot of peace Democrats were now in Congress that did not support the prolonging of the war. In fact, the most recent debacle was the Mine Run campaign, which went to nothing, and the Army of the Potomac comes back across the river and licks its wounds. It was a black time for the president. Also, as my name rose, he'd been keeping an eye on me, but as my name rose in my career in the Western Theater, the president had some mixed emotions, I think, because he wanted to win, but he also didn't want another rival for the White House. When Elihu Washburn of Galena, Illinois, my congressman, introduced the legislation on December the 14th of 1864 in the first session of the 38th Congress, the president was not vocally supportive of it because he thought I could quite possibly be just another general who wanted in the White House. One could easily see why the president would think that, because he was surrounded by generals who all wanted in the White House to take up residence in the executive mansion. So the president was afraid the presidential grub had begun to gnaw on me. So he was pulling back on the reins a bit. And I had made it clear that I had no interest in being a politician or running for office. The president still wasn't convinced. Now, at one point, when Washburn was talking about this legislation, the president told him, I think almost in exasperation, I've never met Grant. I don't know Grant. All I know of him is what I know from you. Who else can tell me about Grant? And Congressman Washburn said, talk to J. Russell Jones of Galena, Illinois, a businessman, and actually who has become my financial advisor now. Jones knows Grant well from Galena and has followed him, maintained friendship. The president wrote him a letter and said, please come to Washington immediately. Now, Jones had also written me a letter telling me in jest but seriousness, don't get involved in this political menagerie. And I had written back to him, I have no intention of running for office, particularly if there's any opportunity for the reelection of President Lincoln. And he got that letter the day he left Galena to go to Washington City to meet with the president. Meeting with the president, he saw where Lincoln was going, and he immediately, he said, pulled out the letter and showed the president the letter I had written. And Jones said the president stood up and clasped him warmly, embraced him, and said, you don't know how happy this makes me feel. After that, he was supportive of the legislation. There was opposition to the legislation because Henry Halleck, was wildly unpopular with the radical Republicans. He was also unpopular with the president because the president said he wanted all the power. When I gave him the power as General-in-Chief, he hasn't done anything with it. He was too concerned about losing a battle. And in those days, losing a battle could mean losing your career. Excuse me. So Halleck had been not much more than a desk clerk in Washington. And there was concern among Congress that if this law was passed, that President Lincoln would turn around and give a 3-star rank to Halleck. And that was definitely not wanted. There was also concern about why should we do this now? For example, President Lincoln excuse me, again, I'm somewhat under the weather with a cold. And President Lincoln was trying to dance between getting a general who could win, not putting a general in an office that would want to be president, and it was a very difficult position for him. Well, Elihu Washburn introduced the legislation on December the 14th, House Bill 26, and talking about resurrecting the rank of lieutenant general. And specifically, the House version specifically mentioned me. Now, I should like to regale you a bit with part of an article from the New York Times on December the 15th of 64, the day after Washburn introduced the legislation. And it says in part, Halleck thus confesses that General Grant's 2 campaigns of the current year of 1863 must be considered the most remarkable exploits that can be found in military annals. And it is certain that in each of them, besides their general features, they were special acts that can only be characterized as the very audacities of genius, such as his cutting loose from his base in the advance upon Vicksburg, and his mode of conducting the attack upon the stronghold of Lookout Mountain. Acts which, though utterly opposed to the pedantic rules of small strategists and of schools, yet prove the loftiness of their inspiration by the splendor of their success. We took occasion on the receipt of the recent news of the rout of Bragg's army to note the fact that General Grant was the only one of our officers whose campaigns had a logical termination. That is to say, that they each ended in the destruction of the opposing army, or putting horrors to combat. Thus logically terminated the campaign whose crowning act was the Battle of Fort Donelson, where 20,000 rebels were put horrors to combat, and 20,000 stand of arms were captured. Thus logically terminated the campaign whose crowning act was the reduction of Vicksburg, and in which, including the battles preceding the surrender, 50,000 rebels were put hors to combat, and 60,000 stand of arms were captured. Thus also, it would seem, logically terminated the late campaign in northern Georgia, for at Chattanooga, 7,000 rebels were captured and as many more were killed and wounded, and the rest of Bragg's army was sent flying in such rout and dismay that only the obstacles of nature saved them from the sword of the conqueror. It is not invidious to say, for it is a fact known to every man in the country, that while these 3 campaigns where General Grant were terminated thus, we have not in our service another officer of any rank who has conducted a single campaign that has had what we may not improperly designate as a logical termination. General Grant has thus won what we could wish other generals had won or might yet win. He has won by his sword and brain a place among the soldiers of the world and among the patriot heroes of America, to whose deathless glory no military titles can add a single ray, but which it would be an honorable and a grateful thing for his country to recognize by putting it upon it its seal. That's a bit strong, to be sure. They were obviously in favor of me receiving that rank. But to counteract that, I should say that in the debate in the House, there were 2 men who strongly opposed the rank being revived, and specifically my name being attached to it. General James A. Garfield, who was back in Congress, out of the field and in Congress, and Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. Now, Stevens said, I think rather dryly, It used to be that the saints were dead before they were canonized. Garfield had said we ought to wait till the war's over and give this to the most deserving general. Well, it was debated back and forth and passed with my name specific. Now, another objection was that by naming me, that was censuring the president, restricting the president's constitutional authority to nominate an individual, and that it also took away the Senate's ability to consent on the president's nomination. So and those were legitimate concerns. Well, it went to the Senate, and their version of it was they immediately struck my name from it, and added that I would be General of the Armies, or the rank would be in command of General of the Armies, because the General of the Army was an unusual position. When the legislation was written back in John Adams' presidency, it didn't give specific authority or titles. So it could be a job either with great authority or no authority. It all came down to the individual's relationship with Congress above him and his subordinates below him. So it was a rather vague title. They wanted it in Congress this time, though, to be specific: in command of all the armies in the field. And the argument was, can't the president appoint a general-in-chief? We don't have to resurrect this rank. He may appoint whom he pleases. But still, the push was, let's pass a law that says specifically lieutenant general rank in command of all the armies. The Senate put together their version, sent it back to the House, and they spent the better part of February debating it. On February the 26th, they passed the bill that resurrected the rank and named that lieutenant general as commander of all armies. It passed the House by 117 to 19, and it passed the Senate by 31 to 6. So not everybody was thrilled about the rank being resurrected, and expressed their discontent with it. So I was then nominated the president on February 29th. I can't ever say that nothing happens on February 29th. The president wrote the note to the Senate and said he nominated me to be the lieutenant general, and the Senate confirmed it on March the 2nd, rather prompt confirmation process. As of March the 2nd, the rank was revived. I was named, I was confirmed, and General Halleck sent a telegram to me to report to Washington City at the earliest possible convenience. I was glad to get the salary of $8,676, I believe, was the annual salary. I'd finally gotten out of debt and had begun to save $300 a month. And I was on my way to Washington. So on March the 9th of 1864, President Lincoln, in a ceremony at the Executive Mansion with my son Fred with me, members of the Cabinet and the War Department, I was awarded the rank of Lieutenant General, General-in-Chief, commanding all armies in the field. I was in command of 1 million soldiers. So therein is some of the background and some of the Washington side paths and steps that occurred for me to get the rank of Lieutenant General, the first since George Washington, and General-in-Chief, commanding all the armies in the field with those duties. Stipulated as well by the President that I would have my headquarters in the field. There was a great deal of argument in that process. I'd like to add that nobody wanted me in an office in Washington. In fact, one congressman said, General Grant is no carpet knight. Interesting term. I wasn't a general to be in an office, and to take me out of the field would be a travesty and might, in fact, cost the war. The president made it clear that he wanted me to be in the field, which is one of the reasons, as I explained to Comp Sherman, that I was going to take the job and I was going to be in the field, because after I'd been in Washington City for just a few days, I saw and told Comp Sherman that I had to be there in person. The president wanted me with my hand on the reins, and also I felt that a lesser man might knuckle under to those trading politicians in Washington. Now that, I should think, is quite enough to say about the path through Congress of the resurrection of the rank of Lieutenant General that I am humbled to tell you was awarded me, commissioned to me on March the 9th of 1864. I hope you see fit to join me again when we come together here in my library or in the parlor and talk about a person, a place, or an event in the American Civil War. I'm Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, bidding you a fond adieu.